January 1991. A $6 million MH-53 Pave-Low helicopter sits grounded at Al Juf Air Base, its pilots refusing to fly through sandstorms and sub-zero temperatures. 3 kilometers away, 8 British soldiers shoulder 55-kilogram rucksacks and begin walking toward the same coordinates. The helicopter never moved. The men walked for 4 nights. General Peter de la Billière, commander of British forces in the Gulf, would later write that he watched the patrol disappear into darkness, knowing he might never see them again. They didn't ask for better conditions. He recalled. They asked for permission. That permission was granted at 21:30 hours on January 22, 1991, at a forward operating base 60 kilometers from the Iraqi border. What happened next would redefine what special operations could accomplish when stripped of everything except the men themselves. The wind came first. It came from the northwest, carrying temperatures the meteorological officers had measured at -11 Celsius, but which felt, against exposed skin, like something far worse. 8 men stood at the edge of the vehicle drop-off point, adjusting straps that were already cutting into shoulders, redistributing ammunition pouches that had been redistributed twice already, 55 kilograms per man, belt kit, Bergen, personal weapon, anti-armor munitions, demolition charges, 5 days of rations, water they knew would freeze before dawn. Sergeant Major Billy Ratcliffe, a veteran of 14 years in the regiment, looked at his team and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The American helicopters had turned back 3 hours earlier, turbine engines choking on sand, pilots reporting zero visibility, mission commanders at CENTCOM declaring the insertion window closed. The sophisticated machines that were supposed to deliver special operators deep behind Iraqi lines sat useless on the tarmac. The British had been offered a seat on those helicopters. They declined. "We'll walk," their commanding officer had told the Joint Special Operations Task Force liaison. The American colonel reportedly laughed, then stopped laughing when he realized the statement wasn't a joke. 120 kilometers through territory crawling with Iraqi armor divisions, Bedouin encampments, and military patrols searching for exactly this kind of incursion. The patrol stepped off at 21:47 hours. No GPS units. The technology existed but wasn't trusted for this range. No radio checks until they reached their observation position. No extraction guarantee if something went wrong in the vast darkness ahead. They navigated by compass bearing and dead reckoning, the same methods their predecessors had used in the North African desert 50 years earlier against Rommel's Afrika Korps. Within 2 hours, the temperature dropped further. Within 4, 2 men were showing early signs of hypothermia. They kept walking. Behind them, the grounded helicopters would remain on the ground for another 36 hours. Somewhere in the calculus of modern warfare, a fundamental truth had been forgotten. These men were about to remember it for everyone. But before understanding what the SAS accomplished, we must return to what the Americans could not. The mission architecture had been elegant on paper. Delta Force operators, the United States' premier counter-terrorism unit, would insert via MH-53 Pave-Low helicopters deep into Iraq's western desert. Their objective? Locate and designate mobile Scud missile launchers for coalition aircraft. The launchers had been terrorizing Israel for 2 weeks, threatening to drag a new belligerent into a war that coalition commanders desperately needed to remain contained. January 22nd offered what mission planners believed would be an acceptable weather window. They were wrong. The sandstorm materialized without warning 60 kilometers from the Iraqi border. Visibility dropped to less than 50 meters. The Pave-Low's terrain following radar, cutting-edge technology designed precisely for low-altitude penetration in adverse conditions, began returning false readings. Sand infiltrated engine intakes at rates the filters couldn't manage. Lieutenant Colonel Roger Whitmore, flying the lead aircraft, made the call at 18:47 hours. Abort insertion, returning to Al Juf. This was not cowardice. The Pave-Low crews were among the most skilled rotary wing pilots in the world. veterans of operations that remain classified decades later. Their judgment was sound. The aircraft could not safely deliver operators to the objective area, and a helicopter crash behind enemy lines would create exactly the kind of international incident the mission was designed to prevent. But sound judgment created a strategic vacuum. The Scud launchers continued firing. The Israeli cabinet continued meeting. The entire coalition architecture, built on the fragile premise that Israel would remain neutral, trembled with each missile that landed in Tel Aviv. General Norman Schwarzkopf reportedly threw a coffee mug across his command center when he received the abort notification. The problem wasn't the pilots. The problem was the assumption underlying the entire operation, that sophisticated technology would always provide a solution. Across the tarmac, the SAS liaison officer picked up a secure telephone and called Hereford. The conversation lasted less than 4 minutes. Sometimes the answer isn't more technology. Sometimes the answer is different men. The men who volunteered for that walk had been shaped by a selection process designed to identify exactly this kind of soldier. Hereford sits in the English countryside, unremarkable to anyone driving past. The headquarters of 22 Special Air Service Regiment occupies buildings that could house a modest agricultural college. There are no signs, no indication that the compound produces what many consider the world's most capable special operations personnel. The selection course runs twice yearly, in summer and winter. The winter course is considered worse, not because of the cold, though temperatures in the Bresson beacons can drop below freezing for weeks, but because the darkness amplifies everything. Candidates navigate between checkpoints carrying weighted burgans, alone, with only a map and compass. No trails, no communication, no indication of how far they've walked or how far remains. The point, one former instructor explained in a rare interview, is to see what a man does when no one is watching and nothing is helping. Candidates who rely on technology wash out. Candidates who ask how much further wash out. Candidates who wait for conditions to improve wash out. What remains are men who treat discomfort as data rather than crisis, who understand that cold is merely cold, that weight is merely weight, that distance is merely the accumulation of single steps taken correctly. The SAS traces its lineage to David Sterling's Desert Raiders of 1941, men who walked hundreds of kilometers across the Libyan sand to destroy German aircraft that conventional forces couldn't reach. That inheritance isn't merely symbolic. It's operational doctrine encoded into every training exercise, every selection march, every equipment decision. American Special Operations, by 1991, had evolved toward technological enhancement. Better helicopters, better communications, better insertion platforms. The British had maintained an older faith, that the ultimate weapon system remained the individual soldier, properly trained and properly selected. On January 22, 1991, these two philosophies collided over the same patch of Iraqi desert. One waited for machines to work, the other started walking. The missiles changed everything. On January 18, 1991, 2 days after the air campaign began, Iraq launched 7 Scud missiles at Israel. They were inaccurate weapons, modified Soviet R-17 with extended range achieved by reducing payload and accuracy. Militarily, they were insignificant. Politically, they were existential. Israel possessed nuclear weapons. Israel possessed one of the world's most capable air forces. Israel possessed a national doctrine of immediate, overwhelming retaliation against any attack on its territory. If Israel entered the war, the coalition's Arab members, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Syria, would face impossible domestic pressure to withdraw. The entire strategic architecture built by President Bush and Secretary Baker would collapse. Saddam Hussein understood this. The Scuds weren't military weapons. They were political instruments designed to fracture an alliance. Coalition commanders threw everything at the problem. F-15. E-Strike Eagles flew continuous patrols over western Iraq. E-8J Stars aircraft scanned for vehicle movement. Satellites repositioned for better coverage. The results were dismal. The mobile launchers, Soviet-designed transporter-erector launcher vehicles, known as TELs, required less than 10 minutes to stop, elevate, fire, and relocate. By the time aircraft reached reported launch coordinates, nothing remained except tire tracks and rocket exhaust residue. Intelligence estimated between 200 and 300 potential hide sites scattered across an area the size of Belgium. We were hunting needles in a haystack the size of Switzerland. One Air Force targeting officer later admitted, with aircraft that couldn't see through clouds and satellites that passed overhead twice a day. What the coalition needed was human eyes on the ground. Teams positioned near the main supply routes that fed the launch sites. Teams that could remain hidden for days, watching, transmitting coordinates in real time, directing strikes onto launchers before they could fire and flee. This was precisely what Special Operations Forces were designed to provide. It was precisely what the weather had just prevented American helicopters from delivering. The pressure was measured in hours, not days. Each Scud that fell on Tel Aviv shortened the fuse on Israeli patience. Someone had to reach that desert floor. Machines had failed. Men would have to try. The British response took shape within hours of the American abort. 3 8-man patrols would deploy simultaneously into western Iraq. Each would infiltrate by different means. Each would occupy a separate observation position along the main supply routes feeding the Scud operations. Each would hunt the launchers that were proving invisible to coalition air power. Bravo 10 would insert by vehicle, driving modified Land Rovers across the border under cover of darkness. Their route took them through territory considered too open for foot patrol, their speed and firepower compensating for the increased exposure. Bravo 20 would insert by helicopter, a Chinook rather than the sophisticated American Pave-Lows, into a position further north, closer to the Syrian border. Their task was the same: observe, report, and if possible, destroy. The third element, the road watch teams, would walk. They would cover the ground that vehicles couldn't reach and helicopters couldn't safely approach. Their insertion would take 4 nights of movement across terrain that intelligence described as semi-permissive, military language meaning that enemy contact was possible at any point. Sergeant Vince Phillips led one of the walking teams, 23 years in the regiment. His rucksack contained, among other things, a photograph of his daughter that he would never mention to anyone. Sergeant Stephen Mitchell led another, his reputation built on an operation in Oman that remains partially classified. The men gathered equipment with the practiced efficiency of professionals who had packed for impossible missions before. They conducted final checks with minimal conversation, communicating through the shorthand of veterans who had trained together for years. At no point did any of them suggest waiting for better conditions. By January 25th, all 3 patrol elements had crossed into Iraqi territory. Bravo 10 was already transmitting targeting coordinates. The road watch teams had established their observation posts undetected. Bravo 20 had vanished. What happened to those 8 men would become the most famous and tragic episode in SAS history. But that story, like the Scud War itself, was only beginning. The planning maps showed the Iraqi western desert as a beige expanse. Empty, featureless, an operational blank slate where 8 men could disappear like stones dropped into sand. Those maps were dangerous fictions. What they failed to capture was a landscape teeming with invisible threats. Bedouin goat herders moved across terrain coalition intelligence had marked uninhabited. Iraqi military installations sat kilometers from their plotted positions. Communication relays dotted ridgelines that aerial reconnaissance had dismissed as geological formations. And then there was the cold. January 1991 brought temperatures that plunged below -5°C after sunset. The desert that baked soldiers during daylight hours transformed into a frozen wasteland by midnight. Men trained for arid warfare found themselves fighting hypothermia, their sweat-soaked clothing becoming thermal liabilities the moment the sun vanished. We expected heat casualty protocols, one veteran later admitted. Nobody briefed us on frostbite. The intelligence failures ran deeper than weather. Patrol commanders received target packages assembled from satellite imagery weeks old. Enemy positions had shifted. Supply routes had multiplied. The Scud launchers they hunted moved nightly, ghosts on a chessboard where coalition planners insisted the pieces stayed fixed. This operational blindness wasn't mere oversight. It reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of what ground reconnaissance actually required. CENTCOM possessed the most sophisticated surveillance apparatus in military history: thermal imaging satellites, signals intercept stations, high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, yet none of it could answer the questions that mattered at patrol level. Where did the farmers walk their goats at dawn? Which wadis flooded during winter rains? What frequency did the local garrison use for routine traffic? These weren't gaps that technology could fill. They required human eyes at ground level, human ears pressed to the cold earth, human judgment parsing the difference between a shepherd's silhouette and a sentry's. The SAS patrols that crossed into Iraq carried maps marked with confident symbols and precise coordinates. They quickly learned that cartography captures geography, not reality. The distance between those two concepts would be measured in blood. When helicopter insertion plans collapsed under operational constraints, American Special Operations units requested delays. They recalculated timelines, lobbied for alternative aviation assets, pushed missions rightward on the calendar. The SAS made a different calculation. They would walk. This decision carries weight beyond the tactical. It represents a philosophical divergence that separates British Special Operations doctrine from its American counterpart. Not in capability, but in assumption. Delta Force inherited a tradition built on technological superiority, on leveraging every mechanical advantage to deliver operators precisely where needed. The SAS inherited something older, the belief that the human body remains the most reliable insertion platform ever developed. Helicopters fail, engines malfunction, weather grounds flights. Enemy air defense networks expand without warning. A man's legs fail only when the man himself decides they have failed. Aircraft give you options, a regiment sergeant major observed years later. Feet give you certainty. This distinction matters because it shapes everything downstream. The unit that expects helicopter extraction plans differently than the unit that expects to walk out. The former optimizes for speed and payload. The latter optimizes for endurance and self-sufficiency. When both plans collapse, and plans always collapse, the philosophical foundation determines who adapts and who freezes. The SAS patrols that infiltrated Iraq's western desert on foot weren't making a desperate choice. They were making a confident one. Every man in those formations had completed selection processes designed specifically to identify humans capable of sustained movement under impossible loads across hostile terrain. The helicopter wasn't a convenience they'd lost. It was a comfort they'd never needed. This is what technological dependence obscures, the difference between capability and requirement. American Special Operations possessed extraordinary foot movement capability, but their planning assumptions had drifted toward rotary wing solutions so completely that walking felt like failure rather than foundation. The SAS felt no such hesitation. They shrugged, shouldered their burgans, and stepped into darkness. Behind them, aviation assets sat grounded on Saudi tarmac, expensive and impotent. Ahead lay 120 kilometers of enemy territory. The math was simple. The execution would be anything but. Consider what 95 kilograms feels like distributed across human shoulders. Each patrol member carried a burgan loaded with mission-essential equipment that transformed walking into an act of controlled suffering. The breakdown reveals preparation as philosophy rather than logistics, every gram representing a calculated bet on what the desert might demand. Water dominated the load, 12 liters minimum, adding 12 kilograms before a single weapon or radio entered the equation. In terrain where resupply meant death or compromise, hydration wasn't a comfort item. It was survival measured in plastic containers. Ammunition came next. 700 rounds of 5.56 millimeters per rifleman. Linked belt for the Minimi gunners. Grenades, both fragmentation and white phosphorus. Claymore mines for defensive positions. The firepower calculus was brutal. Carry enough to win any engagement, except that winning might require abandoning everything else to move. Then the specialist equipment. PRC-319 radio sets weighing nearly 12 kilograms with batteries. TACBE beacons for emergency extraction calls that might never come. Laser target designators for the Scud hunting mission. Night vision devices. Spare batteries for everything, because electronics die faster than men in cold desert nights. Food barely registered. Rations for perhaps 4 days, supplemented by the grim assumption that hunger mattered less than ammunition when contact came. Personal survival items occupied whatever space remained. Sleeping bags rated for temperatures the intelligence briefs had never mentioned. Gore-Tex shells against rain that wasn't supposed to fall. Medical kits heavy with morphine and field dressings. The total weight exceeded what most civilian hikers would consider portable for a Sunday afternoon. These men would carry it across 120 kilometers of enemy territory, moving primarily at night, navigating by compass and stars, maintaining tactical spacing that transformed a simple walk into an 8-hour exercise in isolation. You stop thinking about the weight after the first hour, one patrol member recalled. Then you stop thinking about anything except the next step. This was the entry fee for self-reliance. The Bergen's crushing mass bought independence from supply chains, helicopters, and the technological infrastructure that kept conventional forces tethered to their bases. Freedom weighs exactly as much as you can carry. The goat herder appeared without warning. Bravo 20 had been on the ground less than 48 hours when a young Iraqi boy stumbled across their lying-up position. The patrol, concealed in a shallow wadi they'd identified as secure, suddenly faced the nightmare scenario every special operations unit trains for, but praise never arrives. Compromise by civilian contact. What followed compressed years of training into seconds of decision-making. Sergeant Andy McNabb, patrol commander, assessed the situation with terrible clarity. The boy had seen them. The boy would talk. The boy's father, visible on the horizon with his herd, would investigate his son's discovery. Within hours, every Iraqi military unit in the province would know foreign soldiers occupied their desert. The rules of engagement offered no clean options. Killing civilians violated everything these men believed about professional soldiering. Releasing the boy guaranteed compromise. Detaining him created a burden the patrol couldn't carry across hostile terrain. They chose release, knowing exactly what it meant. We were tactical corpses from that moment. One survivor later reflected. Walking dead men waiting for the mortuary detail. The Iraqi response came faster than anyone anticipated. Military vehicles appeared on the horizon within hours. Helicopter patrols crisscrossed terrain the British soldiers had crossed the night before. The net was closing with a speed that suggested the boy's report had reached ears far more attentive than a local garrison. Bravo 20's compromise became the most studied special operations failure of the Gulf War. But the lessons extended far beyond a single patrol's misfortune, illuminating the fundamental vulnerability of deep reconnaissance missions operating without extraction guarantees. Other patrols faced similar moments, encounters with Bedouin families, near misses with Iraqi vehicle patrols, the terrible arithmetic of discovery, where one pair of curious eyes could transform a successful infiltration into a fighting retreat across 100 kilometers of enemy territory. The desert wasn't empty. It had never been empty. Coalition intelligence had simply failed to see what lived there, moved there, and watched with ancient territorial suspicion as foreign soldiers crossed ground that belonged to someone else entirely. The PRC-319 was supposed to be their lifeline. This high-frequency radio set represented the technological bridge between patrols operating deep in Iraqi territory and the command structures that could authorize extraction, redirect aviation assets, or coordinate fire support. It weighed nearly 12 kilograms with batteries. Every patrol carried at least one, some carried two. They might as well have carried stones. Communications failures plagued SAS operations from the first night. Frequencies that worked during pre-mission testing went silent once patrols crossed the border. Atmospheric conditions that signals specialists had deemed favorable produced nothing but static. The carefully rehearsed schedule of transmission windows became an exercise in futility. Men hunched over encrypted keypads, sending messages into an indifferent void. Bravo 20's communications nightmare became legendary. Their patrol transmitted repeatedly without response, unaware that a combination of incorrect frequencies and equipment malfunction had rendered them operationally mute. Requests for extraction never reached headquarters. Situation reports describing their compromise vanished into electromagnetic silence. "We were shouting into a dead phone," McNabb later wrote, "and nobody told us the line had been cut." The technical post-mortems identified multiple failure points: frequency coordination errors, antenna damage during insertion, atmospheric skip conditions that defied prediction. But the deeper lesson transcended specific equipment faults. Radio dependence had become doctrinal assumption. Planning frameworks treated communication as a constant rather than a variable, building extraction timelines and support requests around the certainty that signals would flow. When that certainty evaporated, patrols discovered they'd optimized for a world that no longer existed. The men who survived did so through resources that required no batteries, navigation by compass bearing, decision-making by patrol commanders' judgment, movement by human endurance. The radio's weight became a tax on mobility, 12 kilograms of sophisticated circuitry that contributed nothing to survival. Technology promises connection. The desert delivered isolation. And in that gap between promise and reality, the SAS rediscovered something their selection process had always known. The most reliable system a soldier possesses walks on two legs and thinks for itself. The mathematics of escape reduce human survival to its most brutal variables. Distance, 120 kilometers to the Syrian border. Time, available daylight hours when movement means death, available darkness when movement means life. Water, whatever a man could carry, minus what the desert would take through exertion, pursuing forces. Unknown but assumed to be in company strength, with vehicles, with radios, with intimate knowledge of terrain that the evading patrol would learn through bleeding feet. Major General Peter de la Billière, commander of British forces in the Gulf, had studied escape and evasion doctrine for 30 years. "The desert equation is unforgiving," he would later observe. "Every calculation must account for the fact that the body is a machine with finite fuel." The patrol members understood this calculus intimately. Walking at night across rough terrain, a fit soldier might cover 3 kilometers per hour while maintaining tactical awareness. 12 hours of darkness offered 36 kilometers. If nothing went wrong, if no dogs were encountered, if no vehicles forced them prone into wadis for hours at a time, water consumption during intense physical activity in cold desert conditions runs approximately 1 liter per hour. Each man carried perhaps 4 liters after ditching non-essential weight. The mathematics suggested they would run dry long before reaching sanctuary. What the equation failed to capture was willpower as a variable. The SAS had developed a selection process specifically designed to identify men capable of operating beyond the point where normal calculations predict failure. The hills of Brecon Beacons in Wales exist not to build fitness, but to reveal character, to find the individuals who would solve the equation by simply refusing to accept its constraints. These men had all walked until their bodies screamed surrender, then discovered that surrender was merely another decision they could choose not to make. The Syrian border wasn't a destination. It was a mathematical problem that could only be solved through the application of suffering measured in footsteps, each one a small defiance against probability itself. Patrol call sign Bravo 20 has become the most documented Special Forces operation in British military history, not because it succeeded, but because its compromise revealed what these men would endure when everything collapsed. The 8-man patrol inserted on January 22, 1991, tasked with cutting a fiber-optic communications line connecting Baghdad to Scud launch sites in western Iraq. Within 24 hours, a young goat herd stumbled upon their position. The patrol commander, Sergeant Andy McNabb, faced a choice that has been debated in staff colleges ever since: kill the child or accept compromise. They let him go. What followed was a fighting withdrawal across 180 kilometers of hostile territory, pursued by approximately 150 Iraqi soldiers supported by armored vehicles and attack helicopters. The patrol fragmented during the first night's navigation through driving sleet and temperatures that plunged below freezing. Corporal Chris Ryan would later testify, "We knew within the first hour that this wasn't an evasion anymore. It was a selection course with live ammunition." The patrol split into 2 groups moving toward the Syrian border. McNabb's element engaged Iraqi forces multiple times, expending ammunition in contacts that left them increasingly exposed. Ryan found himself alone, navigating by stars and intuition toward a border he could only estimate. The cold became the primary enemy, more dangerous than the pursuing soldiers, more relentless than the helicopters that swept the desert with searchlights. One by one, the elements of Bravo 20 began to fail. Hypothermia claimed men who had survived firefights. Dehydration weakened those who had marched through enemy positions in complete darkness. The mathematics of the Syrian border calculation proved brutally accurate. But the patrol never surrendered, never stopped moving toward the objective, never abandoned the training that had prepared them for exactly this scenario: not success, but survival through failure. What happened to the individual members of Bravo 20 who reached Syria, who was captured, who the desert claimed, would reshape how the world understood special operations sacrifice. That accounting would come at terrible cost. While Bravo 20 became a media phenomenon, 3 other SAS patrols continued Scud hunting operations in complete anonymity. Their designations have never been officially released. Their after-action reports remain classified. The men who walked those patrols have given no interviews, written no memoirs, sought no recognition. They represent the regiment's preferred relationship with history: presence without acknowledgement, effect without attribution. What the classified record reveals, in fragments declassified decades later, is that these patrols successfully identified and called in airstrikes on multiple mobile Scud launchers. They established observation posts within visual range of main supply routes and reported vehicle movements that allowed coalition aircraft to interdict convoys before launch. They accomplished exactly what the original mission required. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Beckwith, founder of Delta Force and a close observer of British methods, had once remarked, "The SAS understands something we struggle with. The mission that makes headlines is usually the mission that went wrong." The successful patrols understood this intimately. They moved through Iraqi positions using terrain analysis skills that no satellite could replicate, identifying dead ground and observation blinds through craft learned across decades of low-intensity conflict. They rationed water with precision that kept them operational for extended periods without resupply. They called fire onto targets with accuracy that required human eyes to distinguish decoys from genuine launchers. The Scud launches against Israel decreased markedly after these patrols established their positions. This correlation has never been officially acknowledged. The men who achieved it have never been named. The contrast with Bravo 20 illuminates something uncomfortable about how societies remember military operations. Tragedy generates narrative. Success generates silence. The patrol that accomplishes its mission without compromise, that calls accurate fire and extracts without incident, leaves no dramatic residue for historians to reconstruct. Yet the strategic effect came from these anonymous professionals, not from the famous disaster. The quiet patrols protected Tel Aviv, while the compromised patrol generated bestsellers. Military effectiveness and cultural memory follow entirely different reward structures. 3 members of Bravo 20 died in the western Iraqi desert. Their bodies were recovered days later, scattered across the escape route like markers of human limitation finally acknowledged. Sergeant Vince Phillips succumbed to hypothermia and exhaustion after becoming separated from his element. Trooper Robert Consiglio was killed in an engagement with Iraqi forces while providing covering fire for his retreating comrades. Lance Corporal Stephen Lane died from exposure after the patrol fragmented, his body found in a shallow depression where he had sought shelter from the killing wind. These men walked until walking became impossible. Then they crawled. Then they stopped. General Sir Peter de la Billière attended the memorial service at Stirling Lines, the regiment's headquarters in Hereford. They did not die because they were abandoned. He stated, "They died because they refused to abandon their mission or each other. That is not failure. That is the highest expression of what we ask soldiers to become." The desert kept their bodies frozen in the positions where exhaustion finally claimed victory over will. Lane was found curled in the fetal position, his hands tucked into his armpits, in a final attempt to preserve core temperature. Consiglio lay where he fell during the firefight, his weapon still oriented towards the enemy. Phillips was discovered kilometers from the nearest patrol member, having walked alone into the darkness until the cold took him. What philosophy can we extract from men who chose certain death over capture? The SAS selection process asks candidates a question without ever speaking it aloud. Will you continue when continuation serves no rational purpose, when the mission has failed, when survival probability approaches 0? The men of Bravo 20 answered that question across 180 kilometers of frozen desert. They did not die for Queen and country. Those abstractions meant nothing in the wadis and salt flats of western Iraq. They died because stopping meant becoming someone other than who they had trained themselves to be. They died maintaining identity against the universe's indifference. 8 years after the Gulf War, American Special Operations Forces conducted a raid in Mogadishu, Somalia. The operation required helicopter insertion into an urban environment, real-time intelligence coordination through satellite links, and extraction via vehicle convoy supported by aerial observation. When 2 Black Hawk helicopters were shot down, the entire operation collapsed into an 18-hour firefight that killed 18 American soldiers and wounded 73 more. The parallels to the original Scud hunting debate were unmistakable. Technology-dependent insertion. Single points of failure in the communications and extraction chain. Minimal planning for contingencies that fell outside the digital envelope. Delta Force operators, the direct professional descendants of the men who had rejected foot patrol infiltration in 1991, found themselves fighting for survival because the machines they trusted had been neutralized by enemy action. Master Sergeant Gary Gordon and Sergeant First Class Randy Shugart volunteered to defend the crash site of Super 6-4, requesting insertion despite knowing that no extraction was possible and that ground forces could not reach their position. Both were killed. Both received posthumous medals of honor for actions that represented the same calculus the SAS had always understood. When systems fail, only human decision and human sacrifice remain. Colonel Charlie Beckwith had warned about this trajectory before his death in 1994. "We built Delta to be the American SAS," he observed in a rare interview. "But we gave them toys that the Brits never wanted, and now those toys have become crutches. Someday those crutches will be kicked away, and we will learn whether we built soldiers or technicians." Mogadishu provided the answer. The British example from 1991, walking when helicopters were offered, navigating by compass when GPS was available, trusting preparation over prediction, remained a case study taught at Fort Bragg, but rarely absorbed into institutional culture. The preference for technological solutions over human capability continued to dominate American special operations doctrine through Afghanistan, through Iraq, through operations whose classified failures echo the same fundamental miscalculation. What the SAS understood in 1991, American forces continue rediscovering in blood. The Brecon beacons still claim lives, not enemy soldiers, candidates. Men who come to join the Special Air Service walk the same hills today that selection candidates walked in 1991, carrying the same weight, covering the same distances, facing the same indifferent Welsh weather. The standards have not changed, not by a single kilometre, not by a single kilogram. This fact alone tells you everything about what the regiment learned in that war, and what it refuses to forget. "We could make selection easier," admitted one directing staff member to a journalist in 2019. "Better boots exist, better nutrition, better recovery protocols. We choose not to use them. The mountains are the test. The weight is the test. The man underneath is what we're measuring." Every year, candidates collapse on Fan 4. Some die from hypothermia, their bodies found by search teams in the same valleys where generations of SAS men have suffered before them. The Ministry of Defense faces inquiries, criticism, calls for modernization. The regiment's answer remains unchanged. The standard exists because Iraq proved what happens when you lower it. Consider the elegant cruelty of this logic. The men who walked 120 kilometers through Scud Alley did so because years earlier they had walked these same Welsh hills until their minds broke and reformed into something harder. The navigation that kept them alive in featureless desert was perfected in featureless fog. The load-bearing that let them carry everything they needed was calibrated against these same unforgiving gradients. Technology will continue advancing. Helicopters will grow more reliable. Satellites will provide centimeter-accurate positioning. Autonomous systems will carry supplies. And somewhere in Hereford, men will still be loading 25 kilograms onto their backs and walking into darkness. Because the SAS understands something that defense contractors and procurement officers refuse to learn. Machines fail at the worst possible moment. Bodies trained beyond mechanical limits do not. What exactly do these men understand that others cannot accept? Perhaps only this, that the distance between survival and death is measured not in technology, but in footsteps taken when no one else would walk. That question, what separates those who walk from those who wait, drove everything you've witnessed in this story. If this examination of human capability against mechanical limitation revealed something worth remembering, consider subscribing. More operations like this one remain buried in classified files and veteran testimonies, waiting to be told. The patrol that never made it home. The commander who overruled CENTCOM. The night the desert itself became the enemy. Those stories require an audience willing to listen as carefully as these men were trained to watch.